I assume you've seen the boxes on the upper left-hand corner of TV shows, if you're an American, which display a show's rating and sometimes have letters in them. You might think that American TV Parental Guidelines are like movie ratings, and while they're both ratings, they're actually kind of different. So what do the TV Parental Guideline Ratings mean? And how did they come to be? And yes, the ratings are called TV Parental Guidelines. It's actually like a really stupid name, but no one asked me. In 1948, only 1% of American households had a television. By 1955, 75% of American households had televisions. The law of American communications was based on a 1934 law with a very original name. What was it called? The Communications Act of 1934. The Communications Act of 1934 was basically designed for radios. The act set up the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC for short, blah, blah, blah. You know what? Nobody cares. Movie ratings became a thing in 1968, and the TV parental guidelines were invented way after that. When TV first got popular in the 1950s, people weren't necessarily thinking about rating TV shows. TV had television breaks. Sometimes you're just watching a show and then there's an ad. No, this is not an ad. I have tricked you, for I wanted to ask you to like the video if you're enjoying yourself. What are you doing? I'm shamelessly asking for— Traditional TV had advertisers interrupting a show every few minutes to tell people what kind of hand soap they should buy or, whatever. And in the early days of TV, networks were fearful of regulation. Like they thought the Federal Communications Commission would have to regulate them or something. TV networks decided to regulate themselves. But in many cases, advertisers wanted shows to be more appropriate than even the networks wanted them to be, because they were trying to sell stuff and they wanted the TV show they were selling stuff with to be squeaky clean.
Golly, sure.
Okay.
Advertisers could even veto content on the TV show, as the TV show was thought to be a direct extension of their brand. And they could suggest their own ideas for stuff. Society in general has changed a lot on that front. I think a lot more people realize that a TV show is a TV show and a commercial is a commercial. They're not necessarily one and the same. So overall, it was a weird combination of things that led to the gee golly whiz era of 1950s television.
Golly.
It all led to stuff like I Love Lucy and Leave It to Beaver. Even more adult-oriented programs like The Twilight Zone, which premiered in 1959, were not inappropriate for the whole family. As society progressed into the future, there's been a softening of standards. Yes, as the years passed, some people wanted spicier media. You can only take so much gee golly whiz, you know what I mean? And media wasn't necessarily afraid to become more. To condense something complicated into something simple. To generalize, if you will. Movies could be more intense because they didn't have sponsors. And TV shows tended to stay cleaner due to advertiser demands. As such, a need for movie ratings became prevalent earlier in society than TV ratings. Movie ratings became a thing in 1968. I have a whole video on that if you're, interested. But on television, shows were still unrated. So what did TV channels do? To again generalize, seriously, there's a lot of layers. TV stations tended to put the kind of shows they thought would be appropriate for whatever audience they thought would be watching at a certain time, even though it was still unrated. Daytime and afternoon television was kept more or less appropriate. It was assumed that stay-at-home parents and kids would be watching that stuff, but prime time, and dare I say, late night. Why did I say it like that? But in the 1970s, this target audience approach came to a head with the FCC. Prime time was prime time, the time slot in which literally every demographic could be watching TV. The FCC was concerned about prime time and having kids see things that they shouldn't. In 1975, the FCC proposed a family viewing hour, just so there could be a safe hour for everybody to view prime time television together. With the family viewing hour, TV networks were required to show family-friendly content from 8 p.m. to 9 p.m., which would then encourage more adult programs to be shown later. But controlling what a network could show instead of allowing a network to censor themselves was ruled as unconstitutional because, it technically was a violation of the freedom of speech. And so, in 1977, the family viewing hour was abolished. So alas, TV continued as it was. When cable TV got popular, in addition to having access to the public networks, people could more or less pick out what channels or channel packages they wanted. So you had your network stations, which everybody got for free, and they had to be mostly appropriate. You had your cable stations, which were not free, and those were typically appropriate. But then you had your premium channels, which were the Wild West of swearing, violence, and softcore. A lot of premium channels like HBO did not have commercials, and people were willing to pay for a channel intended for adults, where there weren't any advertisers to necessarily veto whatever. For parents trying to figure out if something was appropriate for their kids, there was this whole use your discretion era of TV. As years progressed into the 1990s, self-regulation wasn't necessarily working that well anymore for parents. Enter Tim Collins. An engineering professor, Tim was concerned with the amount of violence popping up on TV. At 1994's Violence on TV conference, which I don't love violence on TV myself, but I cannot think of a group of less fun people than a gathering at the 1994 Violence on TV conference. At this conference, Tim introduced the V-chip, otherwise known as the violence chip, an invention that could be put inside TVs and used by parents to block violent TV shows. I mean, that was the overall idea eventually with it. The V-chip started out with only violence in mind, but the invention took on a life of its own because the alleged inventor of the internet, Vice President Al Gore himself, was attending the conference, and he thought the V-chip was fascinating. Al Gore told President Bill Clinton about the V-chip, and Bill Clinton loved it. Except, why stop at violence? Why not filter anything you wanted? The V-chip was then used to help partially form the Telecommunications Act of 1996. There is a lot to the Telecommunications Act of 1996, a ton of stuff. I'd elaborate on the details. Basically, it was a long overdue update to the Telecommunications Act of 1934, filled with controversy. What's important to this video, though, is that in this act, which was passed in January of 1996, Congress told TV professionals, hey, within 1 year, we need a TV rating system for children. And they wanted the rating system to work with the V-chip. And since the year 2000, American TVs over 13 inches are required to have a V-chip installed. So on February 29th, 1996, leap year, a whole bunch of entertainment people got together and figured out a rating system that worked for TV shows. And this TV rating system was based off movie ratings. At this point, movie ratings had been around for 28 years. The thing is with movies, there's only a few movies coming out into theaters every single week. A committee can reasonably review every single theatrical movie, but there's a lot more TV that comes out every single week than movies. In 1996, there was 2,000 hours of new television shows every single day. You would need a whole office building of people just sitting in cubicles watching TV every single day to rate all that content. Which, I would volunteer for that job. It was determined that TV stations would rate their own programs based on the universal standards. There's an external committee that meets like once a year to make sure that everybody's still on the same page, but it's nothing like the movie rating system. TV ratings are self-regulated. It was determined that news, sports, and advertising would remain unrated. The TV Parental Guidelines were developed and went into effect on January 1st, 1997. The whole rating thing accomplished two things. First, TV shows now displayed a simple rating so parents knew exactly what to expect for their kids. And second, parents could set up the V-chip in their TVs to block certain kinds of programs. Unless kids realized that the universal unlock code for the V-chip was 000. Streaming services, just like regular TV, also use parental TV ratings on TV shows. Except, depending on the streaming service, parents can block certain ratings on streaming services from the menu. Kind of the same idea that the V-chip was. So what are the TV Parental Guideline Ratings? And why are they more confusing than you might think? The ratings. The box, when shown, is divided into 3 sections. The top section always says TV. Doesn't matter what's in the rest of the box, it always says TV in case you forgot what format you're watching. The second has the rating itself, and the third has the content descriptor. Or, it's blank. We begin with TVY, which stands for all children. I don't know how you get a Y out of all children. There's not even a Y in the words all children. But according to the Parental Guidelines website, Y means all children, whatever. Y is specifically appropriate for children ages 2 through 6. There's no content descriptors with Y, it's just Y. Then there's Y7, which means directed to older children. Again, there's no Y in any of those words, but I'm not gonna ask questions. What makes Y7 different is that Y7 is directed towards kids that can distinguish fiction from reality. I don't know, that's what the website says. But there's an alternation to Y7, a harder rating, Y7, but with a content descriptor FV. And FV stands for fantasy violence. What's interesting about the FV content descriptor is it's not used in any other rating. And it's always fantasy violence, it's not like science fiction violence. I don't get it. But then we move on to TVG. This stands for general audience. Not general audiences, just a general audience. So with TVG, we're out of the kid territory and we're on to everybody. It's supposed to be like both a kid and an adult can find TVG engaging. See, that's a great idea and all until you realize that Bluey is rated TVY, not TVG. And unless this is your first day on the internet, you know that everybody watches Bluey. Then we have TVPG. Standing for Parental Guidance Suggested, PG is an all-age program, which, like a movie rated PG, parents might find too much for little kids. Enter the content descriptors. Well, we already did FV, so the new ones. D, L, S, and V. D stands for suggestive dialogue, and by suggestive, I mean dirty talk. If a show has the D, then it might be suggesting the D. L is for language. We all know what language is. You know, words like, and maybe also, maybe S is for sexual situations. With S, there's no suggestion of sexual situations. It is a sexual situation. It might be kissing, it might be sex. Don't make me spell it out. And V is for violence. I actually hit myself harder than I intended. So any of these 4 content descriptor tags can be used with the TVPG rating. They are not required, none of them could be used, or all 4 of them could be used, it's just whatever the show needs. And even if they are used, it's like the mild version of all of them. Then there's TV14, standing for Parents Strongly Cautioned. Parents are warned not to let kids under the age of 14 watch a TV14 show alone. The way that TV14 is described, it's more intense than PG-13, but I mean, come on, every single person in society looks at TV-14 and PG-13 as exactly the same. TV-14 can also include the D, L, S, and V tags, except unlike TV-PG shows, TV-14 shows show these things in a lot more intensity. And finally, we have TVMA. It stands for Mature Audiences Only. TVMA shows only have 3 content descriptors, L, S, and V. The D, noticeably, is missing. Because when you get to the TVMA rating, there's no need to really suggest sex when you can just show. TVMA is very interesting because on regular stations, the rating is very rarely used due to the restrictions that the FCC has placed. Before streaming and, I guess still today, TVMA was a rating that was typically associated with premium cable. Things that you have to specifically opt in for. So a lot of adult-oriented shows on regular TV are kind of kept at TV-14. But on streaming services, there aren't the same FCC restrictions. So a lot more adult-oriented shows tend to use the TVMA rating on streaming rather than regular television. The Leave It to Beaver days are long gone. With movie ratings, R basically means that kids under the age of 18 need to be monitored, and NC-17 means no kids, period. But TVMA means mature audiences only. TVMA is not intended for kids. It's not necessarily a parent-suggested thing, but I mean, they're not barred like they are with an NC-17 movie. So essentially, TVMA is more intense than R, but it's not quite at the level of NC-17, except it kind of is. I don't really know. But everybody in America treats TVMA and R as interchangeable. So yeah, American TV ratings and their history is kind of complicated, but American movie ratings are way more straightforward. If you want to learn more about movie ratings and their history, click on this video next.